Everyone is watching the sanctions, the spreadsheets, the price caps, the diplomatic communiques. Western governments spent 3 years building the most elaborate financial architecture ever constructed to restrict a single country's oil revenues. They sanctioned banks, they sanctioned shipping companies, they sanctioned individual tanker captains, and by February 2025, they had formally blacklisted 311 oil tankers, each one individually identified, logged, and prohibited from operating within the Western financial system. Russia's oil kept flowing out of terminals like Novorossiysk, the primary Black Sea export hub on Russia's southern coast, and eastward through Pacific routes. The crude kept moving regardless, not because the sanctions collapsed exactly, but because the moment you sanction a vessel, as one investigative outlet reported, another one joins the shadow fleet to replace it. You push one tanker out, another steps in, and the fleet regenerates faster than the paperwork can catch up. By May 2025, independent analysts at S&P Global Market Intelligence had counted 940 unique ships operating outside normal Western oversight, representing roughly 1/6 of the entire global tanker market. The G7 had set a price cap of $60 per barrel to limit what Russia could earn, and Russia's exporters were averaging around $65 per barrel anyway. With Urals crude, Russia's primary export grade from Black Sea and Baltic terminals, frequently clearing the cap, and ESPO blend, the Pacific route grade, trading at around $83 per barrel, well above it. The cap existed, it simply didn't apply to a fleet operating at this scale and in this way. In 2024 alone, Russia earned an estimated $189 billion from oil exports, and the shadow fleet kept the taps open through all of it. So here is the problem that sat on Ukraine's desk. A country under sustained bombardment, outgunned in artillery, watching the financial pressure campaign against its adversary produce results that were, to be diplomatic about it, marginal, needed a different answer. 3 years of the most sophisticated economic toolkit the West had assembled, and Russia's war machine was still being fueled, quite literally, by tankers crossing the Black Sea without consequence. The answer Ukraine eventually reached for cost $245,000 per unit. That number deserves a moment of genuine attention. The entire multi-year Western sanctions architecture, with its teams of lawyers and compliance officers and treasury officials and EU working groups, had produced incomplete results against a fleet that included individual vessels worth tens of millions of dollars each. Ukraine's alternative was a drone boat that costs less than a mid-range apartment in London, and it was about to become the most cost-effective anti-sanctions enforcement tool anyone had attempted. This is the story of how Ukraine stopped waiting for the financial system to work and started disabling the ships instead. To understand why any of this mattered, you need to understand what the shadow fleet actually is, not as a policy abstraction, but as a functioning economic organism. When Western sanctions arrived after February 2022, Russia faced a straightforward logistical problem. Its oil needed buyers and its oil needed ships, and the Western tanker industry, largely dependent on Western insurance, Western financing, and Western port access, couldn't carry Russian cargo without facing consequences. A parallel system emerged in response. Older vessels, registered under flags of convenience, a legal mechanism where ships register under the flag of a country with minimal oversight, places like Gabon or Liberia or the Comoros with opaque ownership structures spread across shell companies in multiple jurisdictions, began quietly absorbing Russian export volumes. They switched off their AIS transponders and in many cases actively spoofed their location signals to place themselves elsewhere on the map entirely. They conducted ship-to-ship transfers at sea, physically moving crude between vessels mid-voyage to obscure the cargo's origin point before it reached a buyer's port. They sourced insurance from providers outside Western systems entirely. By January 2025, only 14% of Russian crude was being carried by tankers covered by the international group of P&I clubs, that is protection and indemnity insurance, the standard liability coverage that underpins virtually all legitimate commercial shipping and that Western ports require as a condition of entry. In the Black Sea specifically, even the sanctioned fleet's P&I coverage reached just 27%. These weren't vessels operating in a legal gray area. They were operating inside a system specifically engineered to be invisible to the mechanisms designed to stop them. The revenues that system protected were extraordinary. The Kyiv School of Economics, which tracked this with forensic patience throughout the war, estimated that the Shadow Fleet generated approximately $9.4 billion in additional revenue for Russia in 2024 alone, specifically because it allowed Moscow to sidestep the $60 price cap. That money went somewhere, and where it went was into the budget that funds the artillery shells landing on Ukrainian cities. But here's the thing about sanctions enforcement that the numbers kept revealing. The problem wasn't just about detecting ships. It was structural. International maritime law is genuinely complicated, with vessels transiting international waters, the waters of neutral states, and zones where no single country holds clear jurisdiction. Turkey controlled access to the Black Sea through the Bosphorus Strait, and Ankara, trying to maintain a difficult neutrality, kept the strait operating under the Montreux Convention, which limited warship passage but gave Turkey no clean authority to stop commercial vessels outright. The Shadow Fleet exploited every gap in that framework with methodical consistency. Ukraine watched this for 3 years. It watched the G7 construct the price cap, watched the EU build sanctions packages, watched the US Treasury's OFAC sanction 183 tankers, including entities connected to major Russian producers like Gazprom Neft and Surgutneftgaz, in a single action during the final days of January 2025. And watched the EU later replace the fixed $60 cap with a floating mechanism set at 15% below average market price. All of it represented genuine effort. None of it had shut the pipeline. What Ukraine did have by that point was the Sea Baby. The Sea Baby didn't begin as a sophisticated weapons program. It began as a necessity born from the absence of alternatives. Ukraine had no surface navy to speak of after Russia neutralized its fleet in the early stages of the war, and what it had instead was engineers, a tolerance for unconventional solutions, and the particular kind of desperation that tends to produce interesting results. The Sea Baby is an unmanned surface vessel, a remote-controlled drone boat carrying a significant payload to a target without a crew aboard. It first drew serious international attention in July 2023 when it struck the Crimean Bridge, a piece of infrastructure carrying considerable symbolic weight for both sides of the conflict. By 2025, the upgraded version had extended its range to 1,500 kilometers, up from the original 1,000 kilometers, and it could carry up to 2,000 kilograms of payload. Modified side compartments opened mid-mission to deploy 6 to 8 smaller FPV drones, and thermobaric rockets rounded out the package. What had started as a single strike tool had evolved into something closer to a mobile weapons platform that happened to travel on water at high speed, and the whole thing cost less than $250,000 per unit. That evolution didn't happen through a conventional procurement process. It happened because someone kept asking what else it could carry. For context, one of the tankers Ukraine struck in late November 2025 was described by Ukrainian officials as being capable of transporting oil worth nearly $70 million. The drone that reached it cost $245,000. That ratio, one tool costing a fraction of a percent of the value it destroys, isn't an accident of circumstance. It's a structural feature of the entire campaign, and it's the feature that makes the economics of resistance genuinely interesting. On November 28, 2025, Ukraine's security service struck 2 tankers, the Kairos and the Virat, in the Black Sea off Turkey's coast. Both appeared in international sanctions databases, and both were operating as part of the Shadow Fleet. Turkey condemned the strikes immediately, noting they had occurred inside its exclusive economic zone and warning of serious risks to navigation and environmental safety. The condemnation was noted. The campaign continued regardless. On December 2nd, the Russian-flagged tanker Medvolga II was struck approximately 130 kilometers from land, making it the 3rd vessel hit within a single week. And then on December 15th, Ukraine's security service announced what it described as the world's first successful combat use of an underwater unmanned vehicle against a submarine, deploying a system called the Sea Baby. Independent verification of that specific claim remained limited at the time, but the direction of travel was clear regardless. Ukraine wasn't just targeting surface tankers anymore. It was expanding the entire concept of what unmanned maritime systems could achieve. And then came July 2026. Operation MoLoChKa, whose name is an acronym in Ukrainian that roughly translates to a phrase meaning Moscow will fall through Crimea, began on July 6, 2026. And within days, it had reached a scale that made everything prior look like preliminary testing. By July 15th, Ukraine struck 17 Russia-linked oil tankers, 2 gas carriers, and 1 tugboat in a single coordinated operation. By July 18th, the Unmanned Systems Forces reported 172 vessels struck across the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov combined, 116 of them in the first 9 days alone. By July 20th, the total had reached 183 vessels struck in just 20 days, and the commander of Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces, Robert Magyar Brovdy, stated the goal with a clarity that left no room for diplomatic interpretation, saying the operation would continue until the Russian Shadow Fleet was listed in the Red Book of the Sea of Azov. The Red Book, for those unfamiliar with the reference, is the Register of Endangered and Protected Species. Brovdy was not being subtle about his intentions. Brovdy also clarified the operational logic in terms that revealed something about how Ukraine was thinking beyond the immediate military objective. The goal, he explained, was not to sink the vessels outright, which would risk oil spills and therefore environmental catastrophe and therefore the kind of international political problems that complicate allied relationships. The goal was to disable them, to render them what he called drifting barges, blind and deaf, neutralized as economic assets without being transformed into ecological disasters. That distinction between sinking and disabling matters because it shows the operation was designed with political consequences in mind, not just military ones. Whether it fully achieved that second goal is a fair question. Reports emerged during MoLoChKa that a Liberian-flagged tanker called the Nordic Zenith, reportedly owned by Nordic American tankers and chartered by ExxonMobil, sustained damage from Ukrainian drones. That claim rests on single-source reporting and warrants careful handling, but if accurate, it illustrates the risk any campaign of this kind carries with it. In a crowded sea where Shadow Fleet vessels operate alongside legitimate commercial traffic, the margin for targeting error creates real political exposure. Which brings the story to what the operation actually changed and what it didn't. The Shadow Fleet's core problem, as the numbers kept demonstrating, was that sanctions created it and couldn't contain it. Every vessel that got blacklisted was replaced by one that hadn't been blacklisted yet, and the KSE Institute tracked that progression with bleak precision, recording 44 sanctioned vessels still loading cargo in January 2025 and 143 by November of the same year. The fleet adapted faster than the regulatory architecture could manage, and for every diplomatic meeting that produced another sanctions package, there were brokers in Dubai or Hong Kong quietly registering another aging tanker under another unmonitored flag, arranging fresh ship-to-ship transfer routes to keep the Urals crude moving without a traceable paper trail back to Novorossiysk. Ukraine's drone campaign found the one pressure point that sanctions couldn't reach: the physical vessels themselves. You can't register a replacement for a ship that's been disabled before it clears port. You can't route around a sea lane that carries active risk. Insurance markets, already thin for Shadow Fleet operators who had long since been denied international group P&I coverage under normal conditions, become unworkable once the probability of a strike becomes something underwriters have to price into their models at scale. Russia's response, according to NBC News reporting, involved President Putin threatening to sever Ukraine's access to the Black Sea entirely, while describing the attacks as piracy. The piracy framing is a genuinely interesting rhetorical choice, given that the vessels in question were internationally sanctioned and being used to fund an active military campaign, and the fact that Russia responded at the level of presidential public rhetoric suggests the strikes were connecting with something that mattered economically, not just symbolically. The broader Western response to MoLoChKa was more complicated. Ukraine's actions occupied legally ambiguous territory that made formal endorsement difficult, even from allies who were privately supportive of the results. Turkey maintained its objections about its exclusive economic zone. The EU's updated sanctions package, agreed in July 2025, adjusted the price cap mechanism, but the relationship between that financial pressure and Ukraine's physical strikes remained officially uncoordinated throughout. None of that changed the underlying arithmetic, and that's the point worth holding on to. A country with no surface navy, operating under sustained bombardment, running a defense budget a fraction of its adversary's size, found a way to impose real costs on a sanctions-busting operation that had defeated 3 years of Western financial engineering. It accomplished this with tools costing less than $250,000 each, and the Sea Baby, which started as an improvised answer to the absence of a conventional navy, became the enforcement mechanism that billion-dollar policy frameworks hadn't managed to be. The 940-ship Shadow Fleet is not gone. Russia's oil revenues haven't collapsed to zero. The conflict continues. But something shifted in July 2026, and the Black Sea stopped being a free highway for Russian oil logistics. Every vessel that transits it now carries a risk premium that didn't exist before, and that premium has a way of showing up in the cost of keeping a war running month after month. If the gap between what financial pressure claims to deliver and what physical disruption actually achieves interests you, this channel covers exactly that territory, and this story is nowhere near its final chapter. The Western financial system spent 3 years trying to make Russian oil too expensive to export profitably, building architecture of genuine complexity and genuine cost. Ukraine spent $245,000 per unit making the ships carrying that oil too expensive to insure. One of those approaches is producing clearer results than the other, and the sanctions architects working in Brussels and Washington know exactly which one.